Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining Informa Pharma Intelligence's Big Pharma Outlook webinar for 2026. I'm Ali Al-Bazagan. I'm the lead analyst of Pharmavitae Analytics, Datamonitor Healthcare's company analysis team. And today I'm joined by Hardik Patel, the lead analyst of oncology.
Hi everyone.
I'm also joined by Michael Haydock, who's the lead analyst of infectious diseases.
Hi everyone.
And lastly, I'm joined by Dan Chancellor, who's the lead analyst of central nervous system.
Thanks, Ali, and hi everyone.
So today we're going to begin with some commentary on the new report's main findings. We're going to look into Big Pharma's growth trajectory. We're going to take a closer look at the specific company's portfolio life cycles. We're going to have a brief look at the new Pharmavitae index, which we have built to rank the portfolio accordingly. And in the second half, we'll then be focusing with the team on the specific therapeutic analyses and then commenting on the challenges and opportunities for the Big Pharma in these specific markets, and just really having a discussion about what they can do to navigate the ever-changing landscape of the industry today. So we'll begin with the most important question, and that is Big Pharma growing? And the answer is yes. Pharmavitae Analytics forecasts this peer set of 10 companies to add close to $25 billion to its top line, generating $330 billion in 2026. Now, you can see from the diagram on the slide deck that Pfizer is really going to maintain its leading position out to about the late part of the forecast period, where Roche, which is armed with quite a powerful launch portfolio, becomes the peer set leader by pharmaceutical sales out to 2026. So there isn't really that much turbulence in terms of the rankings, but there are some small incremental changes in terms of the growth aspects of these companies out to 2026. So what's actually driving this? So a healthy launch portfolio, and this portfolio is mainly concentrated in oncology, will bolster the growth as the result of, I guess, the recent industry innovation, especially within immunotherapies, especially in oncology, for example. Now, as a note, so this data includes forecasts from the current portfolio, but it also includes only forecasts for the late-stage pipeline, so the current late-stage pipeline. So this low 0.9% growth rate out to 2026 really exemplifies the overall drag that Big Pharma is facing, and these headwinds are pretty well known, and that's essentially expiring franchises, and again, this overlying scrutiny on drug pricing. So you can see here, there are three themes, in our opinion, that continue to shape this outlook. And what we've seen is that while strategic trends over the last few years have led to companies focusing on, I guess, demonstrating strength within a particular market, within particular geographies, I guess there are a few specific examples that are going against the grain. And these examples we're seeing, for example, GSK stress the impetus on volume by doubling down on vaccines and consumer health, which we'll be discussing later on in the webinar. But we're also seeing biosimilars continue to boast some investment from Big Pharma. And that's an area which, again, falls well in line with the pressures that are really concerning the global payer environment. So in this light, of course, this leads on to market access, and market access will continue to dominate proceedings with Big Pharma. And we've seen it over the last 2 quarters, Big Pharma really rethinking its approach to price increases. And we're really seeing, and this is all going on concurrently, we're seeing products that, although making quite considerable headway clinically, but the success is being really slow to translate within the marketplace. So we'll be discussing some of those aspects too. But as I said, from the final point, it's not all doom and gloom. Big Pharma will be adding 27 blockbusters by 2021 with an incremental addition of 47 billion, with 9 more by 2026. And again, just to put this all in a bit of perspective, the portfolio currently in 2016, from our analysis, has 74 blockbuster products, amounting to about 170 billion, in which 24 will lose their status by 2021, with 9 more out to 2026. So that just gives you a brief overview in terms of the main data and the main findings from the data and the report. So what I'd like to do is, before we go into the discussion about the specific therapeutic areas, I would just like to sort of share a few key findings and snippets from the report, which will hopefully, provide some interest into sort of reading a bit more about it. So I guess we'll begin with just a brief overview of lifecycle analysis, and we'll just have a look at the Big Pharma's principal pharmaceutical performance. So now, Pharmavitae Analytics uses this data, and what we do, we segment a company's portfolio into core, expiry, and launch. So within the principal pharmaceutical performance, we only include products from within these two portfolios, so the core and their expiry. So we don't include any revenues that's coming from their launch portfolio. So any revenues coming from products that will launch over the forecast period between 2016 and 2026. So with that in mind, we'd just like to sort of provide with the first poll of this webinar, and that is, out of those 10 big pharma companies which you saw on the previous slide, I would just like to sort of ask the viewers of this webinar, which company out of the poll that you'll be seeing, do you think that after 2021, over the midterm, will have the most positive growth trajectory in terms of principal pharmaceutical performance? Right, so what we've seen from these results is we've seen a great deal being placed on Roche. That's coming up at about 47% coming from voting for Roche, and Bristol Myers Squibb about 8%, whereas Merck and AstraZeneca coming in again similar numbers, around 20%. So what I'll do, I'll just go to the next slide, and that should show you the results. And what we've actually seen from our analysis is, taking a closer look into principal pharmaceutical performance, I guess we're really able to gain some visibility on a company's reliance on its pipeline. And as these growth rates do not include them, we can actually see Bristol Myers Squibb's favorable outlook in the midterm, and that really does hinge primarily on Obiva's growth prospects. And even with that in mind, Bristol Myers Squibb does have, I guess, the lowest base in terms of pharmaceutical revenue. So that does, in terms of normalizing growth rates, does give it a bit of a boost. And just on the other side of that, we can actually see, some of the companies within the middle of this chart, and especially AstraZeneca, and you're seeing that negative outlook in 2017, and that's obviously primarily due to erosion to Crestle. So let's now move on to the longer term, and that is really having an idea of where these the big pharma will grow between 2021 and 2026. And interestingly, the trajectory actually reverses. So we're actually seeing AstraZeneca's recently launched portfolio. So that doesn't include any sort of products that are launching over the forecast period, and especially within oncology, would actually be sufficient in offsetting its principal pharma troubles. And we're also seeing other companies such as Merck and Novartis, and they will also oversee some of these important expiries in this period too. And you can just see the negative decline quite visibly in these charts. Now, to supplement this analysis, now we move on to the next slide, and we're really going to now look at adding the launch portfolio. So really having a look at the growth trajectories when the launch portfolios have been included. So again, we're looking at the core products, the expiry products, but now we are adding the launch products which will launch over that period between 2016 and 2026. So again, we can see the effect from the next slide of the pipelines, and again, the main effect is again to prop up the pipelines. And for example, if you can actually follow the chart on the left, you can see a pink line, and again, that is Roche. And what we are actually seeing from our data and our analysis is the fact that there is an inflection point for Roche, and this is again due to Tecentriq and in terms of immunotherapies and Ocrevus in multiple sclerosis, and that's really leading a charge as the company really tries to strategize against its, I guess it's quite the period coming in terms of biosimilar erosion, and really, if we also have a look at the next slide, out to 2026, the company has quite shrewdly, I guess, with a combination strategy in oncology, tried to prolong its revenues, especially within its principal portfolio, by experimenting with novel drugs and with its more established portfolio. So we can actually see that trajectory out there. And again, we can actually also mention Novartis as well. And whilst we are seeing quite a turbulent trajectory for Novartis, it's only because of its growth products and strong pipeline candidates, which will try and come through in the second half of the portfolio against its portfolio erosion too. So that's a snippet of the life cycle analysis, and that will give really a good idea in terms of the total pharmaceutical performance going out there. So I'd just like to also comment on these aspects. So these aspects in terms of our data. So being able to have a look at the portfolio, being able to analyze where each of these products sits in terms of launch, core, and expiry. So what we've actually done to support this is Pharmavitae Analytics has actually introduced a new normalized index, and this is really done to visualize and compare companies in the portfolio by a range of specific criteria that you can see on the left of this slide. And that is really leveraging a lot of the data across Informa Pharma Intelligence's portfolio. So you can see what has been kept is the launch, core, and expiry. We've also kept in the growth rate, so understanding from a short-term perspective. So really that gives the best outlook because it does leverage the forecast from the launch portfolio, and then obviously moving into the long term, and then understanding how the revenues amalgamate within the total 10-year forecast window. So just to give you a brief overview in terms of what we've done to create the index, each metric has been collected and they've been normalized to produce a rating out of 5, and this is actually an equal weighting against the other companies. So again, we'll be able to see in terms of pipeline, we're really looking at this objective data. So looking at phase 3 trials, phase 3 drugs, looking at the proportion of drugs which have an above average likelihood of approval from our analysts in MedTracker. And again, to support that, we're looking at the financials. So R&D intensity. Is R&D spent being translated into their launch portfolio, or is that being translated in terms of efficiency and productivity? So that's something we've looked at, something we've created. So what this has done is actually they've been used to produce a total index score. And again, more visually, the ability to draw conclusions based on this newly introduced crosshair analysis. So it does look a bit busy at the moment. So what this actually does is it shows all the companies being plotted on one diagram, and each color corresponds to one big pharma company. And essentially, this company, this diagram just gives an idea about how the companies will perform in each metric, and really gives a best-in-class view. So again, I just want to reiterate these axes just to anchor what they represent for the next 2 slides. So again, you have pipeline, you have on the main axis the number of drugs, and to support this, you have the phase 3 trials, the proportion of the likelihood of approval being above average, and again, that is by our MedTracker analysts, and then looking at the portfolio. So this is looking at launch, so again, from the previous slides, what's going to be launching over the forecast period, looking at the core portfolio, and again, their expiry. So this is a reverse metric, because the more expiry revenue you have, obviously to more detriment to the company. And again, looking at those growth statistics, looking at on a short term, long term, and again over the forecast period. So just keep that in mind over the next few slides. So what we did is we actually mapped using this framework to each of the big pharma companies. And you can see here that they have been ranked by total index score. And again, aside from color, those astute with, I guess, Big Pharma logos who are looking in, you can begin to quickly generate an idea about, what these specific companies are. So before I get you to sort of go into another poll, I just wanted to just sort of have a brief look at some of these companies without actually knowing what they are. So I just want to cast your attention to the company with the score of 30. So we can actually see from the pipeline, so you can actually see in the top right of this slide sort of what these axes are. You can actually see that whilst the company does have strong pipeline metrics and again a strong core portfolio, it does spend near to the least on R&D, and it does have, as a result of that, the lowest growth trajectories across all time periods. So that really does play a feature into its overall score. And again, if I cast your attention to another company, and that is on the left side of the diagram, and that is with the score of 34. So while this company looks to have, again, the lowest revenue base, and you can actually see visibly it doesn't have any launch revenues from the axes on the left, its growth statistics and its financial margins have boosted its score. So this again points to the conclusion that it should have a strong core portfolio of products. And finally, we'll again focus on the least performing pharmaceutical company. So the company labeled with the score of 31. So you can see here from its pipeline axes that it does have the strongest pipeline. So we're looking at the strongest amount or the most numerous amount of clinical trials and phase 3 assets. However, the company looks, it does have also above average portfolio scores. So you can see on the left, it's doing quite well, but again, it's struggling with its margins, especially its R&D and its net profit. And again, it's struggling to add growth because we can just see that there must be just pointing to anticipated expiry headwinds. So with that in mind, I would like to go to the next poll, and I'll invite you to just have a think about what you think the top 5 pharmaceutical companies are. And it doesn't have to be in any order based on these criteria that I've mentioned. And again, you can see in the top right corner what these actually represent. And I'll just give you a minute there just to have a think and have a check. So you can actually see the results now, and it's actually come through, and Roche, Pfizer, Novartis, and Merck have come up with 50% of the vote, so they've actually won the vote. Then AstraZeneca, Roche, Pfizer, Lilly, and J&J came last with 17.2% of the vote. But those that have actually voted for Merck, AstraZeneca, Roche, and Lilly with 31% of the vote, if I go to the next slide, you can actually see where these companies actually point to. So here are the results. So it's almost a question that I would ask you is, have any of these actually surprised you? Did you actually have a look and see whether, you thought a company did, or maybe it's your company that had a strong pipeline and a strong growth aspect? So it's really just, in our opinion, a very good way to just sort of, it provides a robust framework to really objectively compare against these companies and really quickly visualize this robust data across the portfolio. And again, if we do go back to the companies that I mentioned before the poll, and you are looking at Bristol Myers Squibb, so a hint would have been early in the presentation, who did have the highest growing in terms of their principal pharma, Bristol Myers Squibb, but they don't actually have, we haven't forecasted anything in terms of the late stage pipeline, but they do well across the financial growth and pipeline. And again, looking at Pfizer was the second company that I mentioned. Again, doing quite well, but again, their growth trajectories, especially in the short, midterm, and across, is quite low. And again, finally, those conclusions that we drew about Novartis is something that we know instinctively, that they are investing quite across a lot of areas in their pipeline. But again, it's really looking at those growth statistics and really looking at the fact that they need to be able to be in a better position to overturn their sort of portfolio erosion. So what I'll do is I'll just give you, again, another look at the top picks that we have. So those are the top three, just so, again, it gives you that intuition about being able to reflect on these companies based on this specific criteria. So again, just lastly, if we were just to briefly touch on AstraZeneca on the right, you can actually just see where its strengths lie. So whilst its core base is probably the lowest in the Big Pharma portfolio, its launch portfolio and its low expiry portfolio, coupled by its strong growth rates, has really led to its high score. So yeah, so that's what we just wanted to briefly touch on. And it just, again, that crosshair framework really gives that ability to really objectively compare against companies quickly and visually using robust data across the company portfolio. So I hope you enjoyed sort of having a look and really sort of seeing where the data is actually pointing to. So what I'd like to do now is again, get the rest of the team involved and now hone into a bit more detail into where this where I guess the data is driving these particular scores in the Pharmavitae index. So we'll look at our specific therapy areas, so looking at oncology, infectious diseases, and CNS. And again, we do really want to discuss opportunities and challenges for Big Pharma with you all. So I guess we'll begin in oncology. So if I just go to the next slide. You're able to see that the dynamics in terms of the Big Pharma peer set, especially from the data, oncology is actually doing very well. It's driving the most growth, again, followed by the infectious diseases market, and again, metabolic. So just with that in mind, I guess we'll begin with you, Hardik. We can see that, again, oncology will peel away from the other therapy areas. We're seeing Roche continue to maintain its market leadership, with others closing the gap out to 2026. I'll just, I guess, like you to brief us on the market dynamics and, again, what has really led to and will lead to even more market expansion.
Yeah, so there continue to be unmet needs in almost every cancer indication, and obviously these unmet needs within cancer have dire consequences. So the development within oncology will remain fast-paced for the foreseeable future as it has been in the past. But I think the trend toward personalized medicine within oncology has accelerated the growth of the overall market even more so. The development of targeted drugs for specific patient subgroups has led a lot of larger indications to be subdivided, and that has allowed a large number of therapies to kind of coexist within one particular disease indication. And that in turn increases the value of the overall oncology market. And with these targeted therapies often being very effective in kind of smaller, more restricted patient populations, the companies who are developing these therapies have also been able to demand a high price for these drugs, which of course in turn also increases the value of the overall market.
Great. So I guess in terms of Big Pharma, we're really seeing companies really stocking up on potential assets, and that's across all different targets. But I mean, PD-L1s and PD-1s have garnered the most attention. So I guess if you're looking at the Big Pharma peer set, if you're sitting there without a PD-1 in your portfolio, or your development has been quite slow to catch up, so probably looking at Novartis or Pfizer, you're really looking at differentiation and I guess a shrewd combination strategy to really propel you in the market. Would you just be able to comment on the PD-1 class growth and what makes them really so sought after in the Big Pharma's portfolio?
Yeah, so immunotherapies have been, I guess, a newer approach to targeted medicine in that they target immune pathways to help elicit an immune response against the cancer rather than targeting specific oncogenic driver mutations or pathways like previous targeted therapies. And because of this, they're able to be effective across a wide variety of different indications. And the first major class of these immunotherapies, which you mentioned, is the PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. These drugs are now approved across 8 different indications and are in development for many more beyond that. And because of their ability to kind of elicit really durable responses that are typically and historically unachievable with kind of traditional chemotherapies, they've really altered the treatment paradigm within the diseases that they're approved in so far. And as before, the durable responses seen with these drugs allows drug developers to demand a premium price for the PD-1 and PD-1 inhibitors. And just to give out a number, a full year's worth of treatment with these drugs costs around $150,000 within the U.S.
Interesting. So I guess following that, I just wanted to see if are you anticipating any other targeted pathways that will maybe produce a similar market performance, that dictate immune response. So I guess in terms of our analysis, we're seeing enthusiasm across different classes, as companies are trying to vie ahead of the curve, looking at the next PD-1. Would you be able to elaborate on what you are most excited about?
Yeah, in terms of, next drug classes coming up through the immuno-oncology space, both the IDO inhibitor class as well as CAR T-cell therapies are progressing through development really quickly, especially the CAR Ts, which now have been submitted for approval in DLBCL and ALL. These products are projected to alter treatment approaches much like the PD-1 class of drugs, and so they'll likely also have a large impact on the growth of the overall oncology market as well.
Right. So you mentioned CAR T. So I believe Novartis is touting its asset to be a potential blockbuster. So to me, the technology seems to be quite a complicated area. And for what I want to ask you is from a commercial perspective, do you agree that this is a considerable opportunity? And I guess within the portfolio, which companies do you think will be leading the way?
I do think CAR Ts represent a significant commercial opportunity. For the most part, PD-1 inhibitors, which we previously talked about, really only address solid tumor indications, so far at least. However, CAR Ts are looking to provide similar advancements within hematological malignancies, so there is an open space for opportunity there. And although CAR Ts have seen some problems with adverse events like neurotoxicity, and also it remains to be seen whether there are any issues with logistics of manufacturing autologous therapies. I think the response rates that have been observed so far with these drugs are phenomenal and will definitely lead to quick uptake. In terms of the leading companies within this space, Novartis, Kite Pharma, and Juno all have a heavy stake within this particular area. Kite and Novartis in particular lead in terms of development timelines, as each of them have a product that's been submitted for approval in the U.S. already. Juno was in a similar position up until one of its products was suspended due to adverse events, but the company still has a significant number of other CAR T programs in development. And as I mentioned before, the development of these drugs has been very quick, so it's still very much so in the game here.
Sounds good. So sounding quite positive. So again, I guess moving on to more data from the Big Pharma report. I mean, we're seeing such a positive outlook for oncology, and you mentioned that these novel therapies are commanding high prices, and it's not rare to see payer rejections, especially initial payer rejections due to a lack of cost effectiveness. I was just wondering, just to sort of end there, what you thought the major challenges were facing Big Pharma over the forecast period, and again, how do you think, or how would you actually go about tackling them?
Yes, I think pricing pressures are definitely one of the larger challenges facing drug developers within oncology, particularly those companies developing immunotherapies, as you mentioned. These drugs are already expensive on their own, but now we're seeing even more of a trend of immunotherapies being tested in combination with chemotherapies, targeted drugs, and even other immunotherapies. I think combinations like these will definitely be a prominent part of treatment in the future. So I think companies will definitely need to work with payers a little bit more in order to ensure that these newer regimens are going to be reimbursed. And to, I guess, address the second part of your question, I think one way they might choose to do this is to continue to search for more accurate biomarkers that are predictive of a response to treatment, which in turn allows payers to be more confident that the right patients are receiving the right treatment.
Interesting. So looking at maybe going for even more smaller populations there. Okay, well, so thank you, Hardik. So now turning to the second most valuable therapy area, Michael, we're seeing infectious diseases dominated by viral treatments and vaccines. So, firstly, I was just wondering what your take on the HIV market was, and again, we're really seeing GSK finding success against Gilead in what seems to be a market too, between the two going back and forth. So, yeah, just wondering how you saw the market sort of developing over the next 10 years.
Thanks, Ali. Well, for the first part of your question, I think there is this looming threat hanging over the HIV market at the moment, which is the genericization of leading brands such as Truvada and Atripla. But I do think that in the short term, over the next 2 to 3 years, there's still growth that can be achieved before generic erosion really starts to take effect. I think we'll particularly see that growth in the US market, where we've seen quite rapid uptake of Gilead's tenofovir alafenamide successor products, such as Genvoya, Odefsey, and Descovy. So they're Gilead's way of trying to protect itself from patent expiry of tenofovir. And we've also seen uptake of the recently launched premium price integrase inhibitor-based regimen. So Genvoya is one of those, and Triamec from GSK or Vive Healthcare is the other one. So Genvoya and Triamec are both taking share from the older, cheaper, non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor-based regimens, which have fallen out of favor in the most recent update to guidelines. So I do think there is growth in the market. For the second part of your question about GSK particularly and their battle with Gilead for patient share, I think there is, again, lots of growth for GSK in the short term. That will continue to come from uptake of Triamec, particularly at the first-line setting, where it's the only single-tablet regimen to have taken share from it's the only single-tablet regimen to have demonstrated superiority to Atripla. And so that's really cut into Gilead's market share in the first-line setting where single-tablet regimens are very commonly prescribed. And Tivicay is another string to GSK's bow, or dolutegravir, as its molecule name is. That's really another rapidly growing product, particularly in treatment-experienced patients, and that's because it's viewed now as the best-in-class integrase inhibitor. It's got a very clean tolerability profile and a high barrier to resistance. So in the treatment experience setting, not so much a threat to Gilead because STRs are less used there, but it is very much an issue for owners of other integrase inhibitors and protease inhibitors like Bristol Myers Squibb and Johnson & Johnson. I would say another really important thing to mention in the HIV field is GSK is being very ambitious with a new wave of dual NRTI sparing regimens. So Tivicay and Edgerant is being targeted at treatment-experienced patients, and Tivicay and Epivir for treatment-naive patients. Now, they're really interesting because the standard of HIV treatment for the last 10 years has been to use 2 NRTIs and then a third agent as well of a different class. So 3 or potentially sometimes 4 drugs will be the standard. These 2 drug regimens could completely change that treatment paradigm and allow patients to have more simplified regimens and, more importantly, lower cost for payers as well. So although those 2 drug regimens might actually act to shrink the overall market, for GSK in particular, I think they could be a real growth driver because they could be seen as more cost-effective by payers.
Okay, brilliant. So you said quite a bit about GSK there. I mean, in terms of the data, J&J are going to maintain their sort of second in the market. So where do you feel the J&J will sit across this picture?
Yeah, so J&J currently they're facing a little bit of a difficult competitive dynamic because they don't have an NRTI backbone, which means that they're unable currently to offer a single tablet solution like Gilead and GSK have done in the first-line setting in particular. So as a result, J&J's revenues currently derive really from 2 main products, which are positioned as third agents, if you like. So that's the Persista franchise and Edgerant. The problem they're facing is Persista is expected to go off patent in 2019. So J&J, realizing that they don't have an NRTI backbone, are actually relying on collaborations with Gilead and GSK, who are obviously the 2 main players, to try and grow their market presence over the next few years. So firstly, they're collaborating with Gilead on the development of a single tablet regimen called DCF-TAF. That is the first ever protease inhibitor containing a single tablet regimen, and we're expecting that to help Johnson & Johnson to recoup some of the first-line market share that is lost over the last 5 or so years to STRs as they have increased in number. It's also particularly attractive in the treatment experience setting where protease inhibitors are very commonly prescribed, and it would address the historical inconvenience that protease inhibitors have been viewed to have because they haven't been incorporated into STRs. Secondly, they're working with GSK again with the idea of trying to simplify treatment. So I've already mentioned Tivicay and Edurant. Edurant is Johnson & Johnson's product, but there's another really interesting long-acting injectable combination of Edurant and cabotegravir. Cabotegravir is an analog of dolutegravir or Tivicay. And the injectable combination is being developed as a bi-monthly injection with the aim of potentially improving patient compliance in those who have already achieved virologic suppression on oral regimen. So you might be taking a complicated oral regimen and then you simplify it to a 2-month injectable. And that could be a really, really attractive option for patients with quite chaotic lifestyles who might not have the best adherence to treatment. And again, very importantly, from the payer aspect, it could decrease the overall cost of treatment because you're paying for 2 agents rather than 3 or 4.
Right, interesting. So again, we're seeing them even partner with each other intra Big Pharma, and I guess from what you said, we're seeing quite a lot of innovation in the market too. So I guess if we were to sort of change tact and think about the challenges within the market, do you feel as though payer pressure again will play a role in the HIV market too? I mean, we've seen this quite a mature market sort of forming, but there's still innovation there. So I guess in mind of the availability of generics coming through?
Yes, definitely. So I'm expecting payer pressure will intensify quite a lot, largely due to generic erosion. So the outlook is going to, I think, turn negative for the big pharma players from the turn of the next decade once several generics are on the market. So there are several major brands that have imminent patent expiries. So Truvada and Atripla I've already mentioned, as Persista, Reataz. And so once those go off patent, I think payers are going to be really very keen to capitalize on the cost savings, because an important thing to remember in HIV is that treatment is intended to be lifelong. So the cumulative cost saving that you provide with generics is, in my opinion, too large for payers to ignore. We're expecting the generic pressure to be particularly pronounced in the EU, and that's because Truvada and Atripla are likely to go off patent this year. And with respect to Gilead, that doesn't really give them much time to promote the uptake of their tenofovir alafenamide-based regimens, which they're hoping will protect their portfolio. But it's not only problematic for Gilead, it's problematic for all of the big pharma players in HIV, and that's firstly because once Atripla in particular becomes generic, payers will then have the option of potentially mandating that for first-line use and saying, actually, you can't use the more expensive brands or other single-tablet regimen options unless patients are intolerant to Atripla or have some other reason why they can't take it. So that would severely limit the potential of the first-line setting. And secondly, also the expiry of Truvada. I've mentioned that's one of the standard NRTI backbones. Once that becomes generic, it could also result in physicians being forced to swap patients from their STRs, break those up and prescribe the generic Truvada plus then another third agent. So that's a threat to everyone, really. Of course, that's potentially problematic from the physician and patient standpoint, because from their view, they're going from a 1-pill-a-day option to potentially 2 or 3 pills a day. But in my view, I don't think that will be enough to stop it, because I don't think that currently there is sufficient data out there to show that swapping from 1 pill a day to 2 pills a day or more will actually have any impact on virologic outcomes. And that's really, I think, what the big pharma companies will need to try and show or argue in order to try and reduce the impact of generics.
Right. So there seems to be quite a lot of opposing forces in this market specifically. So, okay, great. So let's just, I guess, pivot our focus to vaccines. So we're seeing quite a lot of big pharmas, as I aforementioned in the presentation, focusing and doubling down and investing in vaccines. From your viewpoint and analyzing these indications day to day, what do you think is creating such a fruitful marketplace? And in terms of the data from the report, we're even anticipating more growth out to 2026 for big pharma.
Well, I'd say one of the factors that makes it quite an attractive space is the limited competition. So although there are quite a large number of vaccine indications, if you actually look at the number of major players, there are only really 4 major players: GSK, Sanofi, Merck, and Pfizer. It is a very specialist subsector, so it requires a lot of investment in clinical development. Trials generally tend to be quite large in order to show protective effect in a broader population. And you also have the barrier of having to have high production manufacturing capabilities. So I think that's one of the things that makes it quite attractive. I'd say maybe another thing is that once a vaccine is on the market, it's quite a steady revenue earner. It's safer, if you like, because most vaccines are used in routine immunization schedules, and you have quite reliable patient cohorts that you can target and that are refreshed each year. So Prevnar is a good example, makes billions of dollars every year just by targeting infants and the elderly, and it's a very reliable market. You also don't tend to see the typical pressure from biosimilars so that you see in other fields, particularly at immunology and inflammation indications. And that's probably because it is a low margin sector. Biosimilar developers are more interested in taking a chunk out of sales of Humira and Enbrel and Remicade. So maybe later on we'll see it, but that's certainly not where the focus is for biosimilars now. And then, of course, all of that is counterbalanced by the fact that you do get lower profit margins. So whereas I do think it is a space that will deliver growth for the big pharma, it will be relatively moderate, as you can see on your graph there.
Right. So you have mentioned sort of the lower profit margins, and this is something I guess we're seeing from the rhetoric from GSK. By investing in vaccines, it's an opportunity to focus long-term returns on volume rather than high margin sort of pharmaceuticals, especially within HIV. So I was just wondering from your perspective, do you think that this is a sustainable strategy for GSK?
I'd say yes, I think it is. So GSK has its hands in many vaccine pies, and there's so many that I don't really have time to mention all of them, but I'd say one of their most promising growth drivers is Bexsero, so that's a meningitis B vaccine. So that's now recommended for use in high-risk adolescents and adults in the US. And also in Italy and the UK, it's been successfully incorporated into the routine immunization schedule for infants. So one of the things they had struggled with was gaining reimbursement in France, Germany, and Spain, and that's partly because its approval was based on immunogenicity data rather than protection data, and just the incidence of the disease is quite low. So from a cost-effectiveness standpoint, it's quite hard to prove that. But there were some really positive data from the UK last year showing real-world protection, so I'm sure that will drive uptake over time in the remaining EU markets. They've also got a couple of quadrivalent flu vaccines, which are quite important to their portfolio. Again, relatively minor growth expected over the forecast period, but because they're quadrivalent vaccines, they've managed to demand a premium, particularly in the US, which will drive growth as markets convert to that. Conversion's been a little bit slower to quadrivalent vaccines in the EU, but we expect that will largely be forced on payers over time because the manufacturers will just simply stop producing the trivalent ones and move to the quadrivalent ones. And then also just a couple of indications that are quite interesting, still very early phase, but RSV and dengue vaccines, interesting ones to watch. Their efficacy is still unproven, and they're very novel marketplaces. But for RSV in particular, GSK is targeting the three main risk groups, so that's the elderly, pregnant women, where you aim to provide passive immunization to infants after their birth, and also infants aged anywhere between, certainly less than 6 months, potentially under 24 months when they're still at very high risk. So they have a good shot by targeting all three risk groups in that market, and we expect that can go, we estimate it's around about $400 million market now in the US and 5 EU. We think that could easily grow to at least $2.5 billion. So that's quite an attractive market if these vaccines do pan out. And then I guess finally I couldn't really finish without mentioning Shingrix, because that's another key growth driver for GSK going forward. So that's their herpes zoster vaccine, showing very impressive protection against shingles in the elderly, and we're expecting that to come onto the market at the end of this year when it gains US approval and really take the crown from Merck's Zostavax, because it's been able to show superior protection in the elderly.
Okay, great. So we're going to see sort of Merck being supplanted within that market. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Michael. So again, finally, we'll head over to speak to Dan. So I guess let's just take a step back and really understand your take on the CNS market. So this is, I guess, the only therapy area which is sort of forecast to see quite a lot being wiped off the top line, so around $6 billion. And I guess from the past 2 years or so, and recently, we do continue to see high-profile failures in the clinic. So I guess, Dan, just first off, what do you think makes it such a difficult market to penetrate?
Hi, Ali. Yeah, thanks. So as you can see, this is against the trends of the oncology and infectious diseases. The CNS market for Big Pharma actually peaked back in 2011. Since that time, you've had quite a few huge products go off patent. When you combine these with some of the high-profile failures you've had in the clinic, It's actually led to quite a few big pharma companies either divesting some of their assets, scaling down, or even just exiting CNS research altogether. I think it's a couple of reasons why it's a particularly difficult market to penetrate at the moment or to operate in. I think commercially, you have the situation where in almost all of the major indications, your standard of care therapies that you're competing against then are now low-cost generics. So this is true if you look at antidepressants, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, and like dementia drugs, Parkinson's drugs, painkillers. It's therefore quite unrealistic for a new drug that will enter the market and really compete as a first-line therapy against these generics while still having this branded price. So rather than compete at a first-line level, pharma companies are really looking at refining their clinical trials and looking at particular patient populations, whether that's non-responders, whether that's as add-on therapies to those generic standards of care. So for the most part, from a commercial point of view, we just aren't seeing these transformational products in these existing classes, and we're not seeing any, products with launch trajectories that, that you might see in other indications. I'd say there's also a clinical and scientific reason that just makes CNS quite a difficult market to penetrate. And in recent years, there have been very few new drugs or new drug targets that have emerged from the research. There have been so many promising targets that have just failed to translate, whether it's exciting preclinical data or even phase 2 proof of concept data, into robust results in these registration trials. I think this has been particularly keenly felt in the field of Alzheimer's research. It's often cited that 99% of clinical trial projects fail. And then in addition to that, there's also been several new approaches in depression and schizophrenia that have just fallen short.
Okay, so I guess it is looking quite bleak there. There seems to be continued disappointment, but I mean, again, we're seeing, I guess from my knowledge, Lilly's late stage asset in Alzheimer's disease, but I guess even in the report, we are seeing big pharma still investing in CNS and development. So I guess from that side of things, I'm just wondering, in terms of your analysis, etc., what markets do you think will, be likely to yield, a sales growth out in the next 10 years, and, how big pharma sort of positioning themselves within that?
Yeah, of course. I think despite some of the doom and gloom that I've just painted there, I think there's still quite an exciting moment for CNS research. This is a personal opinion, but I'm still hopeful that the amyloid theory in Alzheimer's is eventually going to yield a therapeutic breakthrough. But I think more immediately, you have some exciting developments taking place in migraine research and also in depression, where some big pharma companies are operating. And then some of these research projects could have a more immediate commercial effect. So if we start first with migraine, it's a really exciting time. I think these past few months have been very important. Several products have announced some phase 3 clinical trial data. We have our first new drug applications in as well. So there's a new class that's emerging. They're all monoclonal antibodies, and they have a target called CGRP. So these antibodies have been demonstrated to reduce the number of migraines that patients suffer when you inject them subcutaneously. They aren't drugs for pain relief once you have a migraine, but rather you administer them prophylactically as a preventative treatment. So what we know from some of the phase 3 results that have been announced recently, their efficacy is proven, they work. And so the next challenge is going to be for these developers to, negotiate access for patients to these drugs when they do become available. I think the biggest, the spotlight is going to be on the level of benefit. While these are preventative drugs, patients do still have migraines. Drug treatment typically only reduces the number of migraines a patient has in a month by around 2 to 3 migraines each month compared to placebo. But I know, if we look at Novartis and Lilly, certainly they're very, very heavily invested in this, and it's going to be very important for their future performance, quite how this scenario plays out. And we've also got some other big companies, not quite in the big pharma peer set. Amgen and Teva are among those. So that was the migraine picture. I think another one which is really exciting for the future of CNS is happening right now in depression. And specifically, it's the field of research is around companies trying to recreate the antidepressant effects of ketamine, more commonly known as a recreational drug. And J&J is really at the forefront there. So what J&J has done is it's reformulated it's S-ketamine for intranasal delivery, and it's coming to the end of its phase 3, a big phase 3 program. So what J&J is trying to do is showing that you can administer S-ketamine chronically and trying to demonstrate this appropriate antidepressant without some of the bladder toxicity issues or the dissociative effects that you associate with ketamine as a recreational drug. If this pans out and it shows that S-ketamine can be an appropriate antidepressant, it can really revolutionize the way depression is treated. So the current treatment paradigm, you have around about a third of patients that respond to their treatment, a third that have a partial response, and a third that just don't get any benefit from their current treatments whatsoever. And even in those that do respond, that response can sometimes be after a couple of weeks or so. But what J&J has with S-ketamine, or is hoping to produce with S-ketamine, is a drug that can be almost given immediate antidepressant effects and benefit a wide range of patients. It really has a large number of patients that it can target, and therefore there's a huge addressable market there. It's not just J&J that's in this market, although from the Big Pharma peer sets, there is less interest in depression, but certainly this particular area of research is being keenly watched. If J&J can make S-ketamine into an appropriate product, there are many other approaches that are trying to mimic ketamine pharmacology without some of those abuse potential effects. And so it can really, a new class can emerge from this research.
Interesting. Okay, so that sounds just a bit more positive there. So I guess more commercially speaking now, so just moving towards that, we're seeing in the slide now that there's quite visible market contraction there. So I guess we're also seeing, products failing and, market access, again, in terms of this webinar being such a major theme. Do you see any sort of pricing pressures within Big Pharma in CNS over the forecast period?
I do, yes. It's a slightly different scenario to some of the pricing pressures that Michael and Hardik have expressed. I think there's a really interesting example in multiple sclerosis where pricing is going to be very important to the future projection of that market. So we have a situation in MS where you have drugs that have been around for 10, 20 years. They used to cost $10,000 a year per patient. But over an extended period of time, we've just had these double-digit price increases to the extent where these old treatments are now pushing $80,000 a year. And that's really the benchmark where new drugs enter the MS market in. So in the US, these increases have been largely unchecked and have just been swallowed by insurers and premiums. But I think for the first time, actually, we're going to get some new pricing pressures from within the market that might cause some of these price increases to end. So the source of this is Roche's Ocrevus. It's a really exciting drug that was approved back in March, and so Roche is also a newcomer to this MS market. So Ocrevus was accompanied by a fantastic set of clinical data, had really compelling results in relapsing MS, which is a very competitive space. But excitingly, it was also the first drug that showed efficacy among primary progressive MS. These patients previously had no appropriate disease-modifying therapy. And critically, so why this is a pricing pressure question is, Roche priced Ocrevus at a 25% discount at the list price compared to some of its competitors. Despite being a cheaper product, if we look at this graph here, what we're seeing is Ocrevus is still set to perform extremely well. So we have it plotted against some of the Big Pharma competitors here. It's important to note that Biogen is not in this graph, but some of the Biogen products are going to be huge competitors to Roche as well. So when we look at this 25% discount, I say Roche certainly priced Ocrevus for maximum market access. They could have even arguably justified a higher price, considering the innovation that the drug has. So for me, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this one plays out. If we look at our the Red Book, we look at what's happened to US prices since Ocrevus has launched. None of the other companies in MS have dared to increase their price since Ocrevus's availability. I think if this continues, there's a huge amount of downside to most people's projections for the MS market, which continues to hinge on increasing prices in the US. So this is the case for MS. I'm also really interested to see if this is a wider industry trend. So when Ocrevus was approved back in March, there was also another drug, which is Sanofi's Dupixent for atopic dermatitis, and a similar drug that also entered at perhaps a lower price than it could have done compared to some of its competitors. So the big question for me is this a sign of a wider trend that Big Pharma is actually beginning to self-regulate with its drug pricing, or are these just two exceptional circumstances and it will be business as usual?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And just even thinking about Sanofi, they've obviously with sort of in CV have quite had some experience in slower than expected recent launches. So I guess they're trying to put that into negotiations with the new drugs, especially with Dupixent. So I guess on that note, we've covered quite a lot today. I hope that's what sort of somewhat whets your appetite to read more in the report in terms of looking at sort of company dynamics and going into a bit more detail about headwinds in terms of sort of macroeconomic, and then going into a bit more sort of detailed analysis in terms of the main therapeutic analyses. So I hope you've all enjoyed the webinar, and it seems like a good time to end there. And I guess I just wanted to say, a few words in terms of sort of, working on this report and in terms of this webinar. I mean, again, from Hardik, Michael, and Dan, there seems to be, this sense of caution, and especially, with Trump's administration, we're just trying to figure out sort of what's going to happen. So there is somewhat uncertainty there, and I mean, for the next 10 years, it's probably the need for Big Pharma to tread even more carefully, and I guess in different times, is probably at its most intense. And I think over the next 10 years, the industry will continue to see it to adapt to, I guess, crystallizing headwinds, so looking at sort of market access, all other sort of players within the industry, and I think, focusing on this ultimate aim to really ensure breakthroughs and innovations, adequately across all stakeholders, across the value chain. I think that's where we're going to see the most value being added, and really being able to navigate these headwinds that we have been speaking about and appears within the report. So on that note, I would like to say thank you for listening. And like I said, if you did have any questions, please write them in the section below, and we will all endeavor to get back to you if you had a specific question to any of the speakers today. So again, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.